excused.
That is correct.
First thing on our agenda tonight, it's not on my thing, is the superintendent's budget message. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Paula Radich, our interim superintendent, to give us that message.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased. This is my 14th budget message, but my very first in the Salem Keizer School District. And I made a little error in an earlier presentation going over my notes this morning, and I said Newburgh. So if I say that again, I'm certain that you will correct me. What I'd like to do is go ahead and present the proposed budget, and then there will be an opportunity following the presentation for the Board and Budget Committee to ask clarifying questions. So a jigsaw puzzle requires the assembly of numerous small, often oddly shaped, interlocking and tessellating pieces. Each piece usually has a small part of a picture on it, but when complete, a jigsaw puzzle produces a complete picture. The preparation of a school district's budget is not unlike creating a finished jigsaw puzzle. At times, the pieces are difficult to fit. At times, some pieces are missing, but in the end, we create the truest picture based on what we know at the time. Our budget process begins early in the year when our finance office staff scans the environment and creates assumptions regarding both revenue and expenditures. That process is refined with each new piece of information and with whatever lens we use to view the work. It's not easy to build a budget. Sometimes the process comes in fits and starts because, just like a jigsaw puzzle, we may not see how one piece fits with another or why the strategy we used the last time no longer works for the new puzzle. So my thanks to the many staff members of the Salem Keizer School District who assisted in crafting our 2014-15 proposed budget. And I'd particularly like to thank Michael Wolf, our Chief Operating Officer, who's here this evening, Mary Paulson, the Chief of Staff, and Susan Dodds, who is the lead in Mike's finance office and helps with all the staff work that you will be certainly appreciate once you get a copy of the proposed budget. The vision of the Salem Keizer School District is that all students graduate and are prepared for a successful life. We hope that in some measure our work on this proposed budget advances the vision that we have for our students. As you are aware, the district has a strategic plan. This is our roadmap for moving the district forward toward the vision. The Salem Keizer School District has had this base plan for 7 years, but during that time, we have continuously updated and amended the plans, including action plans to achieve these goals. The strategic plan is not designed to capture everything we do in the school district. The plan primarily focuses on our goals for student achievement. But I'd like to just comment on a few areas of the strategic plan because I'm hoping that you will hear threads of that in the proposed budget this evening. So the strategic plan goals on teaching and learning primarily include the systematic collection and use of data to plan for instruction, designing strategies for college and career readiness, professional development and teacher training, employee evaluation, a new emphasis on early childhood education, shared decision-making and communication with our parents and community partners, and facilities improvements. So we develop our budget with the strategic plan as only one of the filters used in putting forward our proposal. The Board and Budget Committee recently viewed this slide, and this is the history of 12 years of funding in the Salem Keizer School District. And the chart is designed to show you the new revenue and shortfall that we must consider when we're planning our budget. So over the last 11 years, and then also in planning for 2014-15, you'll see that 8 times those budgets were shortfalls, 8 of the 12 years. In this chart, the current service level represents the roll-up of cost of living increases, adjustments to our insurance, the restoration of furlough days, and a modest increase in enrollment. So once the dollar amount for the current service level is determined, it is then compared to the available revenue, and then to balance the budget, we either reduce our expenditures, or in this case, we recommend some additions to our budget. Fluctuations in the state funding over the past year have caused significant budget deficits, and thereby creating a climate of significant instability and, frankly, disinvestment in Oregon's K-12 schools. Over the past 5 years, the Salem Keizer School District balanced our budget by using reserves, by working with our associations to achieve concessions, including wage freezes and furlough days, reducing classroom teachers, administrators, and support staff, and foregoing the purchase of instructional materials. So over the past 5 years, the Salem Keizer School District has reduced our budget $144 million. The total proposed budget for the 2014-15 school year is $616 million plus. Now, as you look at this particular pie chart, you will notice that the largest share of our overall budget is the general fund, which represents 64% of our overall budget. And the other funds, as you will note, are generally designated funds, including capital projects, debt service, and enterprise funds. And I'll be happy to give you an explanation of any of those if you have questions regarding those funds. So our focus this evening is our general fund budget. And that general fund budget proposal is $395 million plus. This general fund budget represents an increase of just over 7% of the 2013-14 general fund allocation. But keep in mind that that increase also includes enrollment growth estimated at just under 1%, one-time funds from the grand bargain of $7 million. And you remember the grand bargain is when the legislature agreed to add $100 million to K-12 schools in the second year of the biennium. The difficulty with the funds derived from the grand bargain is there is no commitment for ongoing support of that number for the next biennium. We have received new funds from a poverty reallocation. I'll talk about those in just a moment. So the comparisons from year to year are not identical because revenue streams often change. And I think we explained to you in the last work session, many of these adjustments in revenue actually came after January. So how is the general fund budget allocated? Generally in 4 areas. The largest of those, 87% of the general fund budget, is in salary and benefits. That makes sense. We're a people business. Only 3% is allocated to supplies and materials, 6% to purchase services, and then 4% for other. And the other includes our contingency fund and transfer of funds that are allocated to restricted accounts. 2014-15 will be the first time in 6 years that we will not make cuts to our budget or ask our staff for concessions. That is a celebration. So let's talk specifics. So for the 2014-15 proposed budget, based on an estimated $6.6 billion for K-12 funding from the state legislature, the revenue from the state school fund is estimated at about $340 million. The exempt revenue at $16.9 million, and that includes flow-through from the Willamette ESD in lieu of services. The grand bargain revenue, which I mentioned, so for that $100 million for K-12 schools in the second year of the biennium, the Salem Keizer School District will realize about $7 million of that amount, so about 7% of the general state fund. Again, the adjusted poverty allocation, the state of Oregon for a number of years has generally derived the poverty allocation and the weightings for students primarily based on the number of students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. However, the state legislature asked the Oregon Department of Education and the State Board of Education to have another look at the poverty allocation, believing that we have some new data now, new census data, that more accurately describes the poverty levels. The sad part about this adjustment for the poverty allocation is that there are winners and losers in the state. There are districts that lost revenue, and Salem Keizer gained an estimated revenue of additional $2.6 million. And then we have something called the May adjustment. Oregon Department of Education annually takes a look at enrollment and teacher experience, and that's how districts receive a significant amount of their funding. When districts project enrollment, typically districts will project a lower enrollment. And that makes sense because if you over-project and you get more funds and you expend those, you can put yourself in tremendous difficulty. So every year about this time, it'll be coming up next month, is something called the May adjustment, where districts will receive an adjustment, either a plus or negative. Most districts will likely get a positive adjustment, although there are some that will not. The low end of that May adjustment is estimated at around $2 million, but we know that it will be higher than that. The $2 million is a very conservative estimate at this time. We'll have a better figure for you next month. So when you add all those revenue pieces together, you get a total projected revenue of $368 million. So how does all this factor into the general fund budget for next year? Well, you take the $368 million in revenue, and then we add our ending fund balance. And that ending fund balance is $26.6 million, and it's within the range that the board has authorized for an ending fund balance of 5% to 7%. So when you add the ending fund balance to the projected revenue, we come up with a general fund budget of an estimated $395 million. So how do we figure then what we have left to spend? Well, we take a look at this $395 million and we subtract what we talked about relative to the current service level. Remember, the current service level includes the restoration of all the furlough days. Our licensed and classified staff took 5 furlough days, administrators took 6. Also, this accounts for restoration and some minimal increase in cost of living and insurance for employee groups, and a very modest increase in enrollment growth. So when you factor all those elements into the cost for the current service level, and you subtract those from the revenue, that leaves almost $9 million left for us to invest back into public schools for next year. What is that really? That $9.9 million is really only 2.5% of our general fund budget. So when we look at turning the corner in the Salem Keizer School District, while it's a positive, remember that number we showed you, the $144 million in reductions? This only accounts for about 7% of that $144 million in putting back into our system. So we have a long ways to go. So let's talk specifics about what this proposed budget will provide. It provides a full school year. It maintains current programs, addresses enrollment growth, and we're estimating that 1% will generate about 21 teachers and 13 classified staff. Remembering that when you look at enrollment growth, we're also talking about enrollment in our special populations that have a different class size ratio given the disability of the child and may need additional supports. This budget accounts for inflation, cost of living adjustments, steps, and insurance for staff, and targets an ending fund balance of 5% to 7%. The other proposal we have in this recommended budget is to lower the budgeted contingency from 5% to 3.35% for next year. Why is that? The budgeted contingency is there basically to support the district in times of significant emergency. Our concern is if we continue to leave those funds in the contingency and not have them work actively to support our classrooms, we have a lot of funds tied up in contingency, whereas our ending fund balance is probably sufficient to warrant taking care of any district emergency. So this budget also calls for a restoration of $9.9 million into the schools and to instructional programs. So how do we decide what to add to the budget? Well, we've used at least 4 different filters as we look through this process, including our strategic plan. One of those filters is determine what is needed to get results. And by results, we mean what does it take to graduate our students from school, reduce the dropout rate, move our English language learners forward toward proficiency, close the achievement gap, and move all students forward. The second filter is what is legally mandated. Oregon Public Schools have a number of legal mandates. Some of those are state board initiatives or rules, and the others are, many of these are also federal regulations pertaining to special education and English language learners. We also pay attention to the values of our community. We believe that at least 2 values of our community would be to reduce class size and to retain the academic options we have for our students. And last but very importantly, we talk about the value of the input and the feedback we've heard from our internal stakeholders. We have met with our licensed and classified communication groups, our association, our leadership team. In the time that I've been in the Salem Keizer School District, as of Friday of this week, I will have visited 45 of our 64 schools. When I go on those visits, I specifically meet with the principal and I ask them what their needs are for the coming year. And when I have an opportunity and visit classrooms or talk with staffs at a staff meeting, I ask them the same thing. And I ask them what's missing from our proposed budget. Our community and you, the Budget Committee and the Board, will have opportunities through our budget hearings to provide feedback and also recommend changes or proposals to this budget. So here's what we've been hearing from our staff, that large class sizes impact our teachers' ability to be effective and to differentiate instruction for students. That teachers want us to continue our focus on professional development. They tell us that more time is needed. Staff feel the loss of school-based support systems, and in particular, we'll talk a little bit later about the role that counselors play and effective learning teacher supports play in some very, very large schools that have very limited supports. In addition to that, we've heard that instructional materials are needed that align with the new Common Core. It has been since the year 2007-08 that we, as the Salem Keizer School District, did any significant purchase of instructional materials. That means for the last 6 years and in this transition to Common Core standards, we have our staff doing an inordinate amount of time, spending a tremendous amount of time trying to align what they can to the Common Core and modifying curriculum. And certainly when we went out to groups of our staff and asked what's missing, they were very clear that what was the plan for upgrading technology, replacing aging workstations, and how are we preparing basically for the change in the state testing system to a very different test that will require greater capability. So based on what we heard from our staff, here's what we're proposing that be included in the 2014-15 budget. First of all, we're proposing that we reduce class size for kindergarten through 3rd grade by 2 students. Estimate for that is about $2.7 million and would add an estimated 36 teachers, licensed teachers, to our classrooms. We're proposing that we hire high school teachers to address proficiency requirements for graduation. As you know, we have some students who are at risk of not graduating, particularly because they're having difficulty meeting the state standards in reading, writing, and mathematics. We're proposing to hire additional counselors. In 2011 and 12, the district reduced counselors by 19. We propose adding back 13 of those counselors, and those are dispersed, as you can see, by according to different grade levels. Well, I guess you don't see that there, but they're spread out about almost 10 for elementary, about 4.5 for middle school, and an additional 5 for the high schools. Purchase instructional materials, that's a very large ticket item, but if you can imagine going from 2007-08 to the present with no significant investment in instructional materials, there's a pretty big gap. When you look at that number and compare it to the 40,000 students we have in the Salem Keizer School District, the allocation per student is approximately $72. You can't buy a high school chemistry book most days for $72. However, this is a beginning of an investment to get us back on track. So in 2014-15, the focus for instructional materials will be on Common Core implementation and in particular some supports for elementary teachers who are trying to implement the new math standards. This $2.4 million also accounts for staff development that would need to take place. If we're bringing in new materials, our staff need to be trained in the best use of those materials. We also recommend funding to address growth and class size in selected self-contained special education classrooms. Since 2009, our special education population has grown by 8%. We're recommending the addition of effective learning teachers for job-embedded professional development. Research says that when teachers receive well-designed professional development, that we can advance student achievement. We'd also like to address the enrollment growth in AVID. As you can see here, we're recommending an additional 0.5 licensed FTE, but the AVID program has grown from 265 students in 2008-09 in grades 6-12 to almost 2,000 students today. The strategies that AVID uses with students and staff have a very high leverage point when it comes to advancing and improving instruction and student learning. I mentioned the increase in special needs students. We are recommending the additional costs and funds for transportation for students with special needs. Between the 2012-13 and 2013-14 school year, the district saw an increase in special education enrollment of 259 students. Students' disabilities include autism, communication disorders, blindness, emotional disturbance, traumatic brain injury, and those who are medically fragile. Not all special needs students ride these small buses, but a significant number do, and these buses must be modified to handle those in particular who are medically fragile or students who may have significant behavior issues. And obviously, if those students have that great of need, we're not going to be able to put a lot of students on a single bus. We also have included some funds in here to offset the costs of our move to the new OSAA, Oregon School Activities Association League. In the past, we've primarily played schools within the Salem Keizer School District. However, now we've added Forest Grove, McMinnville, and West Albany to our league, so that will necessitate some additional busing. We're recommending the addition of some funds for temporary staff to accelerate our hiring procedures. We are estimating that we will need to hire between 200 to 300 staff for the next school year. Now, those staff are not all driven by class size reduction. Some of those are replacements for individuals who have retired or resigned. Some of those are due to enrollment increases. Some of those are due to class size reduction. But those positions also include special educators, English language learner, teachers, and other specialists. We've also are recommending the set aside for a startup for career technical education, so that should we be successful in achieving an agreement to move forward with professional technical education, that we have the necessary funding to begin the startup. And that particular career technical education strategy is part of our strategic plan that we prepare all students for college and careers. And our aim is to establish premier career technical education programs. We also recommend that we continue targeted support for teen parents by funding some child care for individuals who are teen moms who are currently on the waiting list. These are young people who would not be in school without this support. We're recommending that we continue to fund the campus monitor at McKay High School. This was previously paid for or funded by a federal school improvement grant. We also have received requests from the principals of North Salem High School and Parish Middle School to add a campus monitor between those two campuses. We're requesting to continue to fund an assistant principal at Roberts High School. This position was previously funded by a school improvement grant. We're also proposing that we add funds to address maintenance and repairs at schools and other district facilities. So this would represent a $250,000 investment in addition to the $500,000 that is currently budgeted. So we are pleased to be able to offer a full school year and have funds to put back into schools and instructional programs. However, the $9.9 million represents only 7% of the $144 million we've cut since 2009-10 and only 2.5% of our general fund budget. There are still many areas in our district that need to be addressed, and it will take some time and adequate funding from the legislature to address the reductions this district has taken in the last 5 years. We also recognize the necessity of replacing aging technology and upgrading our computer labs in preparation for the implementation of the Smarter Balanced Assessment. Our recommendation is that we use some of the funding from the May adjustment to provide additional supports in technology. And as an example of some of the work that our technology staff have just completed this year, the technology staff this year are replacing the computers in the testing labs in our schools. By the start of next school year, every school in the district will have a testing lab with PCs 5 years or newer. The tech staff have also completed this work in 43 schools and have 10 more to go. When their work is completed, they will have replaced 1,845 PCs. We will also have assessed each of the labs and fixed the wiring issues to ensure maximum bandwidth. So that's even with a limited budget. Imagine what we can do with a little bit more infusion of technology funds. So K-12 school funding in Oregon is neither sustained nor is it adequate. Fluctuations in state funding over the past decade have resulted in budget deficits in 8 of the 12 past years. 12 years of funding history show a pattern of instability and deep fluctuations, making it extremely difficult to plan for the long term. So we are focusing our budget on our priority, student achievement. We are planning for the future, but we're also trying to be careful to make sure that whatever we implement and recommend in this budget can continue and move forward. The greatest concern our administrators and staff have said to us is, if we put these resources in our schools, will the budget necessitate a year from now that we pull all these back out? So we're trying to be cautious and conservative in our approach because we want to be able to sustain and put ourselves on a trajectory for a long-range plan to build sustainable supports to our classrooms. So what are the next steps? Obviously, we'll have some discussion tonight at the Budget Committee meeting. There are public hearings scheduled for May 19th and 20th, and the school board is scheduled to take action on the proposed budget on June 10th. However, they have really technically until June 30th to approve the budget. Budget meetings are also scheduled for May 21st and 22nd if they're needed. So on September 3rd, 2014, the Salem Keizer schools will open our doors to 41,000 students and their families. Our resources will be limited, as will our classroom supports. Within our challenge, however, lies an opportunity to renew our dedication to our students. The legacy for our children is not what we lack, but how we formed community and how we directed our limited resources to support their learning. In the end, it matters. It matters that we work together. It matters that we move forward with renewed commitment to teach them all well. It matters that all students graduate and are prepared for a successful life. So thank you. This concludes the budget message, and be happy to respond to questions that you may have.
Thank Thank you, Dr. Radich. Are there questions about this presentation? Mhm.
I had a question on. You gotta hold it down. Oh, okay. That work?
Yes.
That works. On the counselors, I think the number on the slide was 13 point something licensed FTE, and I think the numbers you listed added up to considerably more than 13. So are some of the positions part-time, or?
Let me see, we've got proposed 7.5 plus 3.5. Yes, some of were less than full-time. 7.5 for elementary, 3.5 for middle, and 2 for high school.
Okay.
Does that add up to 13? I haven't done the math in
Yeah,
my
I
head.
think
but
that's.
Paul says yes. Okay, thank you. Great question, thank you.
Other questions? Susan?
Yeah. This one? No? Oh, there I am. Okay. In the support staff, and especially considering the poverty allocation monies, has there been any discussion of reinstating certified librarians in the Title I schools for kids who traditionally don't have a lot of ability to get to the public library and don't have a lot of encouragement? In Salem, depending on where you live, you don't have free access to the public library. And it's been proven over and over again in schools, elementary schools especially, and especially in Title I schools where there's a good library media program, reading scores have accelerated and have not in schools that don't have that program in the Title I schools. So has there been any thought to looking at the Title I schools for at least a half-time certified librarian?
I would tell you that the concept of the discussion surrounding librarians has come up on occasion. However, it has been very clear when we did our assessment with our staff and our conversations, we asked all of our staff and our administrators, if you had to prioritize these list of recommendations, what would they look like? Restoring a full school year, class size reduction for the youngest children, K-3, instructional materials, those were the highest priorities of the staff. It's not that the others weren't mentioned, but when we said, what else were you concerned about? They wanted definitely to upgrade technology. We do have some very, very fine individuals working in our libraries currently, and I have visited the schools and walked through the libraries and talked with some. You're correct, they're not teachers. So there is a difference, but I think we have libraries that are very, very rich in literature, and I think we're continuing to upgrade that literature to include nonfiction because that's what our students need to be able to focus on. As I said, this budget is a very small incremental increase, and we consciously said, let's direct it to a very few things that we think we can do well. We can't give everything to everybody, and we cannot restore what was lost in the last 5 to 7 years. It's just not possible with 9.9 million.
Chris, Ben, Jim, Ben. Boyd, thank you. True. Right out of my brain.
For the last 2 years, the Budget Committee has spent some time together learning about infrastructure. You've mentioned technology, you've mentioned classroom materials, and said that we basically can buy maybe a textbook for each kid in the district. But what I would really like to have sometime in this process, and it doesn't need to be tonight, but maybe on May 6th, is sort of an update that what this budget does to start helping those problems. I'm really concerned that at some point the district's going to hit a spot where we have to replace 50% of our buses, say, or we have to replace huge amounts of things that we need in order to do business because we haven't been replacing in a 10-year cycle 10% of it every year. So if we could just have sort of a report on what this budget does to start helping that problem, that would be very helpful for me.
So I appreciate the question, Chris. This budget does not specifically address some of the infrastructure you're talking about. However, we have discussed the depreciation of buses, and an account that will fund bus replacement. That's what it's intended to do over time. So we can discuss with you in generality, at least, some of the thoughts we have surrounding the infrastructure. We're certainly aware, not only in maintenance and transportation, if you don't take care of it, it's gone. And then the cost to buy entirely new is even more problematic. And sometimes we have to buy new. Some of these items are to the point that, and I think Kristen Dewis uses a good term in technology. We replace things that are dead, and those are dead computers. And we also probably have some buses that are close to death. So we're very, very much aware of that, and we could give you sort of probably a broad brush stroke of that.
And that's what I'm looking at. I just want to have some assurance that we're going someplace with that, and we're not going to end up 3 years from now really in the soup.
I would hope not. I think we have a reasonable plan to consider some of those things that you're mentioning, and be happy to discuss those with you.
That'd be great.
Jim?
Thanks, Nancy. So staying at the 30,000-foot level on this overview of the budget, and you mentioned it was like $2-point-something million investment in additional curriculum.
Yes.
How's that spread across our levels? I don't want to know specific purchases, but I mean, are we more heavily investing that in the elementary levels, where we're really moving Common Core along quickly, or
Yes.
where's that at?
I believe, and Sue Ricky-Smith is here as well tonight. As I recollect, because Sue has spreadsheets with all this data, and we were out in the field, when I talked with teachers, in particular at the elementary level, tremendous frustration with mathematics curriculum. They like the math curriculum that we have, but it's very cumbersome, and we need individuals to come together this summer and organize it for our teachers. The teachers like the modules, but it's taking them way too long to winnow through all the materials and put those materials into a structure and a framework that's really usable in the classroom. So we think we can help them with that by doing some preliminary work. Sue, do you have any comments you'd like to make relative to the question of levels?
It's across K-12. What we did is we went out to the highest need areas. So we knew that middle level, middle school social studies, because the state had readjusted and revised the state standards. So that addresses the need for a textbook into every student's hands, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. In terms of mathematics, it was primarily at the elementary, but there were some places at the secondary level, Algebra 1 specifically, that needed more support, and that's also in the budget. Relative to language arts, there is a broad brush stroke addressing K-12, and so there are materials that are going into teachers' hands to help them to teach truly Common Core and use materials that we have already invested in this district relative to our literacy strategy around use of metro text. So it is, every level has been touched. That also includes, Jim, our dual language programs, so that our Spanish students also are going to receive additional supports K-12.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Lloyd?
I have several questions. Can you describe the effective learning teacher? We have instructional coaches, we have mentors. Can you just briefly describe what that concept is?
Mentors are a little bit different than what I would say instructional learning, effective learning teachers and coaches are. Mentors are individuals who primarily work to encourage our new teachers to remain in the profession and who serve as supports to them. These other individuals go directly into the classroom. They observe instruction with the teacher's permission and model instruction for the teacher so the teacher can learn how to do that skill better. So it's what we call embedded staff development. It's in the classroom. It's not we're going somewhere to a meeting and we're going to learn all this, because some of that's valuable as well, but it's how do you actually implement what you learned in the classroom. So these folks are modeling lessons, giving teachers feedback when the teacher tries a skill, what worked, what didn't, how could you do it better. They're not evaluating the teacher. The principal does that. They're there to support the teacher and help them learn these skills and do them every day at a better and higher level.
So
Just another word for coach.
No. although there are a lot of similarities in the jobs.
You had more questions, Lloyd?
Yeah, a couple others. We have $400,000 for the career tech.
Yes.
Are we simply considering adding an additional career tech program and not considering using people who are currently doing career tech at other, within the district?
We're trying to do both. We would like to create premier career technical programs in our existing high schools, but also have a specialized career technical education center that could be used potentially by the community college and by the community. So the first modules for that, if we go forward with that plan, would be construction and manufacturing. But in addition to that, potentially over the years, we would add things like robotics, STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics type courses. So we have, within this budget, there are funds as well to maintain the current career technical education programs, as well as to begin a couple of new ones that would be a central site for students from all of our high schools that could participate in those programs. And there would be a little bit more in depth. There'd be more of a career cluster arrangement than simply a single course.
Can I just clarify that at this point, we're trying to ask clarifying questions about the budget message, and that the next meeting will have opportunities to ask really specific questions about specific aspects of the budget. And I also would like to point out to the budget committee members that after this meeting, we're having a work session, the board is having a work session on career technical education that would, if you stayed and listened to that, help clarify some of that information that you're asking about, Lloyd.
Okay. One last question. What's a campus monitor?
It's an individual who basically keeps bad people from coming onto your campus.
Security.
I think we have great students, and I think generally they're very well behaved, but we have some parts of our community where we've been challenged by individuals trying to come onto our campus that don't belong there. So their job is to make sure that those folks do not intrude and create a safety issue for our children and our staff.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other clarifying questions? Rick?
Yeah, I want to check a few numbers. So 9.9 million is what we believe we're going to have in addition to roll-up costs.
Correct.
Okay. And early in the discussion, you said part of that 9.97 million is actually what we consider one-time money.
Yes.
Because it's grand bargain money.
Right.
So we think it's one time. Okay, so that leaves 2.9 is not one time. On budgeted contingency, 3.35%, do you have off the top of your head where we've been before? I know we've cut contingency in the past. Is this lower than we've even cut in the past?
I'd have to have Mike, I don't know the history on that. I'd have to have Mike respond to that.
Sure. We typically, when we do the roll forward, we try to plus everything up. So early on, we'll be building in a 5% contingency early in the process. But typically, in the last several years, we've budgeted at or near 3% for the contingency, which will be part of the ending fund balance in the end. But we haven't had a budgeted contingency at 5% since I've been here.
Okay, that's kind of what I was after. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't see any other hands, so I think it's time for us to take a brief recess so we can distribute the budget materials, and then after that, we'll have Mike going through what's in the book, kind of a walkthrough, and then we'll review the meeting schedule. Yeah.
Thank you.
You are free to move around the building. Oh, I'm taking all those notes, and then they gave it to us. Sir, did you want a copy?
This is just the slides.
Oh, thank you.
You know, it's wishful thinking.
Merry Christmas.
Loose leaf this time.
They have a, thank you, sir.
Memo. And this is existing protocol for the Budget Committee. And so I wanted to just do a quick review, and it will help set up the May 6th meeting for us a bit. So this addresses a protocol for questions and topics that arise during the Budget Committee meetings from committee members. And while most of the questions that pop up could be hopefully easily answered right there on the spot, there will be some that we'll need to do a little bit of research, maybe sometimes a lot of research. And when it comes to a lot of research piece, that's where the Budget Committee has an established protocol that essentially there needs to be sufficient Budget Committee interest in a question or topic to assign that to staff to do the research to bring back the answers. And so that happens, we will be assigned the question or the topic to bring back when there are 6 members, the member interested in the topic or question, and 5 other members that are interested, and then that will suffice for an assignment for staff. Now, in preparation for the May 6th meeting, relative to the questions you may have regarding the proposed budget, obviously we won't have the full committee, and we certainly would like your questions sent in to help us prepare for the May 6th meeting. So I would suggest, as long as it's okay with the vice chair, that you go ahead and send those questions to me, copying the chair and the vice. And what we'll do is staff will work with committee leadership to determine which of those questions would best help set up the May 6th meeting, and we'll focus on answering those. We'll track all of the questions, so your questions won't get lost. We'll just bring the remaining list that we didn't address back to the committee on May 6th, and you can all decide if it's something that you want us to pursue. Any questions about the process? If you have any, you can send me an email about about that too. All right, let's dig into the document itself. We call this our smiley face budget because we're actually adding to it, not taking away. So again, if you just open up the binder, we have 12 tabs. The very colorful front shows you all of the areas tabbed out. I would bring your attention to tab 2. Let's start there. That's actually the introductory section. You'll go from, there's a lot of great information here, a lot of background information. It's riveting. It's also focused on the budget and forecasting process. Page 10 talks about student enrollment, gives you a background of where we've been over the years. Page 12 is allocation of resources and performance results. We have quite a few metrics that we use throughout the district. Page 18, changes in debt. Page 20 would be the financial summaries, and that includes the budget assumptions. I think that's important for the Budget Committee to understand, and if you have any questions about, we should focus there to make sure you understand the assumptions that we built the budget on. And then page 24 is our financial management policies. You move to tab 3, it's the organizational section. You'll find general information about the district, including the strategic plan, the profile of the district organizational chart, definition of the various funds and classifications of revenue and expenditures, which are in alignment with the Oregon Department of Education's program budgeting and accounting manual. And then if we move to tab 4, you'll have the financial summaries of the total budget and each fund. And that's, I would recommend you look there, get grounded. You've got all of the financial information in those pages, and then you move into the individual funds, which are tabs 5 through 11. So tab 5 is the general fund. Tab 6 is the special revenue funds. 7 is the debt service funds. 8 is the capital project funds. 9 is the enterprise fund. 10 is the internal service funds. 11 is the trust fund. And that will be a good evening's worth of reading, those 12 tabs. But if I could go back and highlight some of the general fund areas briefly, and that would be tab 5. If you, pages 79 through 91 are the summary of resources and requirements. And then you move into pages 92 through 142, and those are the expenditures by function. And that's really the heart and soul of the general fund. That's where the major categories of the general fund, which include instruction, the major functions, instruction, support services, the enterprise and community services, the facilities acquisition and construction, other uses of the general fund, and the operating contingency. So again, that's really the heart and soul of the general fund. And then on pages starting 143 through 167, it's all of the different summaries, summary charts, crosswalks, functional codes, object codes. It's just different ways to look at the classifications of the expenditures. But I would focus my early attention on the summary of resources and requirements starting on page 79, and then the meat of the general fund starts on page 92 and goes through 142. So that was my attempt at a light touch on a very thick document. Any questions?
I'm sure you all have that completely memorized, so you wouldn't have any questions, but Chris?
Mike, I remember for last several years, there's been that community guide that has sort of a summary of a lot of this stuff, and it's a much more,
Yeah.
we can handle it a little easier.
Yeah.
Is there going to be one? I can't remember where it came along in the process.
It comes after the adopted budget, and we work
okay.
on that during the summer.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's actually a summary for the community of what we decided, not helping us to decide. Okay.
Oh, the
Right.
last year's
The
one might
adopted.
help you
Yeah.
somewhat, and it's online, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, absolutely.
It is.
Any other questions? Okay. I need to remind you of the meeting schedule. So next Tuesday, May 6th at 6 p.m. here, we will have a question and answer session regarding the budget message.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, Matt.
Oh, yeah, it is 2 weeks. I'm like skipping next week. We don't have anything to do next week, really. The board doesn't. Much to- 2 weeks from tonight, thanks. Then the week of May 19th to 22nd, Monday through Thursday, we'll have budget hearings. So the hope is that we will not take all 4 of those days, but please keep them available in case they're needed. And the hearings end when we're ready to take action on the budget. Tuesday, June 10th, the budget goes before the school board for adoption. Questions about that? I received an email last night from Sarah announcing her resignation from the committee as she's going to be leaving our community, and I wanted to take this opportunity to thank her for her service. We'll miss you. And if there's nothing else, I think we are adjourned.
Or 7:15, Tuesday, April 22nd, 2014, in Room 2 at the Support Services Center at 2575 Commercial Street, Southeast Salem, Oregon. This meeting is called for the purposes of discussing career technical education. All board members are present except Jeff Faville, and Chuck Lee is not here in his role as school board member, and I'll turn it over to Chuck for a moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Just a reminder that this evening I'm not here as a member of the Salem Keizer School Board, that I was employed by Mountain West back in July of this year to work on developing a CTE program, high school, and because of that, I am not going to be participating in any discussions that you might have as a board member. Here to answer questions, to talk about our goals a little bit, but I just clearly wanted to remind you all that I've got my Mountain West hat on tonight and not my Salem Keizer School Board hat.
Thanks, Chuck. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Radich. Dr. Radich.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and members of the board, as you're aware, this is I think the third or fourth work session we've had relative to career technical education. And as we discussed at our last meeting, we're prepared to come forward this evening with a little bit more detail relative to what a potential agreement might look like. So what we'd like to do is begin with Dr. Noy, who will give you a little bit of objectives for the workshop, and then the CTE vision, just a brief recap of that. And then the district's legal counsel, Paul Dikopoulos, will walk us through the memorandum of understanding, the proposed memorandum. Then after that, would like to engage the board in discussion, and certainly I think if you have questions as Paul's discussing some of this, I think, Jim, you're going to have to decide if you want him to go through it all the way or how you want to handle potentially clarifying questions. So I think, and then we'll conclude hopefully with next steps, and I think that's what. So we'll go ahead and begin with Salem at this point.
Thank you, Paula. Just a quick overview of the purpose of the work session today is to bring you up to date relative to the conversation that have been ongoing between the school district and Mountain West CTI. And if I can direct your attention to the timeline, I only have 3 slides and I have copies for you right here if you'd like to follow as I go through that. And I apologize for my voice. I'm trying to hang on to it, get it to hang on as much as I can. So we've had 3 work sessions up to this point. In December, there was a proposal submitted to the board by Mountain West CTI to develop this public-private partnership relative to a CTE center for the purpose of expanding CTE opportunities for our students. The board had a great conversation and directed us to bring back some information that highlighted the CTE programs in the district, and that was the focus of the January 28 work session. So we provided great details relative to the number of programs, the scope of the programs, the articulation agreements between us and other colleges, and the opportunities that are available for our students. From that work session, the board directed us to bring back some cost estimates as to what it would entail to offer programs at a facility that would be purchased by Mountain West that starts with 2 programs and adds 2 others every year for a period of 5 years. We provided the board with that information relative to specific programs, program support, staffing, supplies, services, maintenance costs, transportation, etc. Once we've achieved that level of specificity relative to this partnership, the board directed us to engage in developing an MOU, a memorandum of understanding that would clearly spell out the roles and responsibilities of each party, and that's the purpose of tonight's work session. So we've been working on that, and Paul is going to share with you the details of the MOU, and I really want to thank Paul and Chuck and all of our team really for their involvement in this process and their patience in developing the specific and the various details associated with this venture, if you will. Before we jump into the MOU, I just want to go over the vision one more time, maybe. There we go. Okay, we did have a vision. And this vision has been in play for quite some time, from what I understand. It's something that the Salem Keizer School District has been wanting to do for a long, long time. So as we interact with community members, as we interact with staff in our district, the idea of a CTE center, especially in a district our size, is one that many get excited about. And when you have a vision, sometimes it's really hard to pick the best time or the best timing when opportunities present themselves. And I understand the challenges that we've experienced over the past 5 years or so, but we do have an opportunity, and this opportunity fits that vision. So as an outcome of our work session back in March, we talked about the governor's 40-40-20 goal, and this concept fits within that vision. It actually addresses that middle 40. We also talked about a vision where students will have access to expanded career and education pathways. We talked about making sure that our students are college and career ready, and this opportunity provides that goal for them. We talked about career CTE programs that are high wage, high skill, high demand. We talked about articulation with colleges and business and industry partners that lead to college credit, but also lead to skill certification as students exit these programs and pursue further education or training, or be ready to go into an entry-level job within an industry. So we believe that what we have presented and what we are continuing to share with you lives up to this vision that we've established. So at the last session, we also discussed with you program design, and I just want to use this to frame the MOU because it builds on the program design that we shared with you last time. We discussed having a planning phase in 2014-15. The 15-16 will be the first year of the CTE Center. We discussed having 2 CTE programs to start with in construction and manufacturing. We talked about adding 2 additional programs per year after that, going all the way up to 2019-20 school year. We talked about limiting the scope to 11th and 12th graders with an anticipated number of 180 students participating in the first year and growing that thereafter. The model calls on students to spend half of their day at the CTE Center and half of their day at their home high school. We talked about providing transportation to and from the center, and that this would be a partnership with colleges, business, and industry, as well as Mountain West, of course. So that is the program design that we've built this MOU on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to talk about the specifics relative to roles and responsibilities and obligations, and all of the information that is contained in front of you in the MOU document.
Thank you, Salam.
Do we have copies of the MOU? Paul, to hand
It
out?
was sent to us.
I can't print it off right now. My home is in disarray.
We do have hard copies.
And I can't use my work computer to print off school district computer.
We have some copies.
We have hard copies.
What's the latest?
Doing a little bit of remodel at my house, and I don't have internet right now.
What's the latest?
Lovely.
Okay, yeah.
And I can't use my work computer
No.
for that.
Didn't know if there'd been an adjustment this afternoon or not.
Thank you.
Do you want
No, I
questions
have it right
during
here.
or
Thank you.
want me to hold them?
Well, let me first start by thanking,
I'm sorry to interject, Paul. We left out Chuck off of the agenda, and we had planned on Chuck providing an update relative to where Mountain West is in the acquisition of the property. So if you don't mind, can we have Chuck do his piece? and then
Whatever would
we'll
be
shift
most
into the
helpful.
MOU? Okay.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Chuck.
No problem. Thanks, Salam. We're excited. Our goal from the very beginning was to develop a career technical education center that really focuses on high impact, high efficiency STEM programs and a good career tech education to really give our kids in our school district the kind of experiences that they need to be ready for the workforce to go on to college. And we've gotten an awful lot of support from various groups in and around our community for this program. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to come up with the funds necessary to purchase a facility that fits in with the MOU that you have in front of you, which is an existing facility that is large enough to house all of the different CTE programs that we might want to have over the next 5 years. The Nielsen Manufacturing Facility on Portland Road is something that we've been able to come up with an agreement. I see Brent Nielsen out in the audience there. And the Nielsen family was very helpful in negotiations with us to be able to come up with this facility. It's contingent upon us getting an MOU with the district. It's contingent upon operational agreements, lease agreements, and some due diligence and a few other things. But we have been able to move that far along, and we're very, very pleased with that. As you can see, this is kind of what our architect's rendition of what this facility would look like. It's 148,000 square feet, which is very similar to the footprint that we were talking about back when we were coming up with our 2008 bond measure. That facility, you might recall, was about $70 to $80 million to build that. It did not make the cut because we wanted to keep our funding or our request for the bond at $242 million. So it's always been part of the vision in the district, and because of Mountain West and the Nielsen family, I think we've been able to put something together to accomplish that with a good public-private collaboration. You can see the architect's rendition there of where that facility would look like. It needs to be upgraded both from the parking standpoint, but also the outside of the facility. We figure that'll be about $1.2 million to take care of the exterior part of the building. The interior of the building is large enough for us to have a variety of different programs. You can see over my shoulder this way here that the construction and manufacturing areas are designated in the red. And every year, if we add 2 different CTE programs to that, you can see that in 2016-17 is reflected by the green areas. The 17-18 school year is reflected with the blue areas, and the yellow areas is kind of the last year of the program that would get us up to using that whole 148,000 square foot facility, which the district has determined would serve about 1,000 kids. So it would eliminate a lot of overcrowding in our schools, and again, provide a capstone program that we'd be very, very proud of. So I just wanted to bring you up to date on that, and I'm here again to answer any questions or whatever you might have regarding the program. Currently, as I said, we've acquired the funds to purchase the facility, contingent upon the items I mentioned, but we are now in the process of submitting grants to foundations to take care of the renovations and also the equipment that we hope to provide. So, Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Chuck. And I'd like to say how helpful it has been to be able to work with Salem and Chuck on this proposal. I tried to figure out what would I liken this experience to, and it's like 2 people riding 2 different bicycles, trying to build each other's bicycles at the same time, not just one bicycle. There are so many moving parts in this that when you get down into the details, and I'm supposed to be the board's detail guy, then I have a lot of questions, and I'll go through those tonight. But before I go through some of my questions, let me just tell you what I tried to do and what this memorandum of agreement tries to do. First of all, I put a memorandum of agreement, I replaced the word understanding with agreement, because make no mistake about it, this is not aspirational. This is a contract. And I wanted to use a stronger word than just understand, a memorandum of understanding. This is a binding document on both sides. Next, the general concept is that there would be a 5-year term for this agreement. The school district would develop a master CTE plan, and I defined that a little bit on the first page of the agreement. Starting with 2 programs, and the general design would be that the programs, initial programs, would open in September of 2015. Mountain West Career Technical Institute would acquire property, and this is great news from Chuck today, because this morning, we did not have this level of detail, because Chuck has been building his part of the bicycle while we've been building ours. So that's very promising news. So they would acquire the property, they would remodel the property to Salem Keizer educational specifications. In other words, this has to be a building that can be used by students. And so it would have to be remodeled for educational purposes. Mountain West will donate the necessary equipment, and that's a big expense. So they would be in charge of funding the acquisition of the property, the remodel, and the equipment. And they do all of that so we could open in September of 2015. The MOU basically talks about the school district's responsibilities to market the program to students, recruit students to the program, hire staff, and once the program is running, maintain the equipment and the building. And then to add programs every year, two programs per year would be the district's responsibility. The MOA would contemplate that the district would enter into a commercial lease for the facility, a 5-year lease for $1 a year. And this would be a commercial lease. As Chuck said, the property is about 148,000 square feet. And I don't remember the exact number for the first 2 years, like 40,000? 20,000 or 40,000?
It will be 20,000 for the first year. Yeah.
So the concept being that we'd lease 20,000 square feet the first year for $1 a year, and then add 2 programs at roughly 40 and progress, so that at some point in the future, the whole CTE master program would be in this facility. There's been some discussions about what Mountain West might do in by way of donation sometime in the future. And the memorandum of agreement talks about the fact that although there's been such discussions, there's nothing that requires a donation from Mountain West, nor anything that requires the acceptance of the donation by the board. So that's the overall concept from the 40,000 foot view. So I've divided the agreement into sections. There have been many drafts as we've talked about what might work for the parties. Section 2 generally talks about the purpose. Section 3 about the preliminary discussions. I'd like to spend some time tonight talking about Section 4 and the whole issue of what do we do about the 5-year term of the agreement and the contingencies for one or the other parties needing to get out of the agreement. Section 5 talks about the obligations of the parties. Section 6 about the construction and operation of the facility. Section 7 is the general statement about Mountain West's future intention to at least consider a donation. And Section 8 is the process that we would go through if one party needed to terminate the agreement. So next I want to talk generally about the obligations of Mountain West. I've mentioned some of these already. Acquire the facility, they need to get city approval to site an educational facility at that site. There's a land use requirement that the city approve any site that's going to be used for school purposes. Mountain West would be responsible for remodeling the facility according to the school district's educational specifications, and There have been some discussions already with our facilities department on what those might look like. Mountain West would be responsible for fundraising for the remodel and for the equipment, and I think we've talked about some of the expense of the equipment
Yes.
during our last work session, and it's not a small dollar amount. Mountain West would then donate the equipment and install it and do everything they needed to do to have the facility ready by September 2015. The school district's obligations is, number one, to approve the facility. And now we know what facility we're talking about, whereas in previous times, we didn't know exactly where the facility would be. So now we know. And so the district would approve the facility, provide a more detailed estimate of the costs of the CTE program, and Salem has been working on that and shared some of that with you. Develop the curriculum and the CTE master plan, recruit students, hire staff, and develop a budget through the board that supports the CTE program. The idea is that once the program starts in September of 2015, it is 100% your responsibility. The operation, maintenance, and repair and upgrade of the facility is yours. Now, some of this would be spelled out in a lease agreement, and this goes back to my comment about trying to build the bicycle while we're trying to ride it. We don't have a lease agreement yet. The MOA promises that we would work on a lease agreement and that the parties would successfully work out those details. And so some of these details about the maintenance of the facility are pretty typical commercial lease provisions. What's our responsibility for the heating system, for the exterior of the building? What's our responsibility for insurance? And all of the things that a commercial tenant would want to iron out with the landlord, commercial landlord. So some of these things are going to be in a lease agreement, and the things that don't belong in a lease agreement could be in an operational agreement. And we don't have an operational agreement yet. Things like what would Mountain West do with the vacant space in the first, second, and third years? What would their responsibility be to prepare that space that we're not going to lease? Would they bring someone else in to that space? If they brought somebody into the space, what kind of an enterprise would that be? What would the responsibilities of the parties be vis-a-vis your educational program? How would these people interact with students? Would the building be open for other tenants, and at what times? These would be things not typically in a lease, but we'd need to somehow document a whole series of things we haven't thought about yet, because we're just now understanding, well, what would the facility look like and how long would it take to fill? So it's not anticipated that an operational agreement would have any lease money attached to it, but it would spell out the details that we'd need to know before we could bring our students and staff to this building, and so that Mountain West knew what their responsibilities were for the vacant space. And we'd have to figure out the operational agreement between now and September 15, or September 2015. And so there would really be three agreements: this memorandum of agreement, a lease agreement that would look very much like a commercial lease, and then an operational agreement. And as I said earlier, the lease agreement for the facility would be at $1 a year. The memorandum of agreement does not say that, but that's what the lease agreement would say. So that's the general structure. Now let me move into the challenges. this is very much like looking out an airplane and saying, well, I'd like to go from here to here, but when you actually get on the ground, there are all kinds of obstacles that you have to be cognizant of, and that's what I'm trying to point out for the board. Some of these things we haven't figured out how to do it, and I'm hoping that you have questions or comments that might help us figure out some of your ideas. The first big issue is, how does the board encourage a very generous gift of property, a remodel, and equipment, and at the same time retain some flexibility in what the board might want to do with the CTE program. Mountain West, as Chuck just said, has made an offer on property that's contingent upon you approving a memorandum of agreement, an appropriate operational agreement, and a lease. And as I understand Mountain West's position, and this could be, Chuck can add his perspective on this. Mountain West does not want to enter into an agreement that gives the board unfettered authority to get itself out of the agreement. If they're going to invest the kind of money that they're talking about, they want some assurance that the board is in it for the long haul, for at least 5 years. But there are some contingencies before September 2015 that we have to talk about. The first was, what if Mountain West can't find a suitable location? Well, it looks like we can cross that off our list. Next question is, what if they can't raise sufficient funds for the remodel and for the equipment before September 2015? What happens to the memorandum of agreement? Some of these questions that I'm going to raise today are probably low probability occurrences. But if we don't address them now before you vote on an agreement, we don't want to be surprised later on. What if the parties can't agree on the educational specifications? We're just beginning conversations about what would this space need to look like. We have to have a common agreement on what the space, how the space will be designed before we can put students in it. And likewise, Mountain West doesn't want to spend a bunch of money on a remodel only to have us say, boy, we don't like how the building is arranged, or it has things that students shouldn't be around, et cetera. So my question is, how do we resolve that, and when? What happens if we can't agree to the lease agreement? What happens if we can't agree to the operating agreement? Now, again, we think we can do those things, but Mountain West is ready to buy property based upon your positive reaction to this transaction. But they'll be doing that without a lease agreement. So I have put in the current version of the memorandum of agreement these kinds of contingencies so that either party can get out of the agreement before September 15th. That's a sticking point. Mountain West is not likely to want to buy this property without having some more, some of these issues addressed. And so I built them into this memorandum of agreement knowing that they're sticking points.
Can I ask a question? I thought I heard you say earlier that the sale of the property, maybe Chuck said it, the purchase of the property, the acceptance of your offer from Nielsen and Company was contingent on this, a lease, and an operating. I mean, all of those things. So if we haven't even begun.
And some due diligence and getting zoning properly accomplished
So-
for the city.
So all of those things, if we can't work through those, then Mountain West isn't going to have invested the money into it because those were all contingencies of this purchase, I thought I heard.
Right, and again, I draft this memorandum of agreement knowing that there were conversations between Mountain West and the seller of that property, the owner of that property. But I didn't know how far along they were or when they could come to an agreement. And so if they have, that it simplifies at least those issues, the contingency issues that would need to get resolved, so that if you as a board were to approve this memorandum of agreement at your second reading, which is contemplated to be in June, then there'd be enough protection for both sides, at least prior to September 15th, that if something went wrong in the transaction for Mountain West, they could get out, or if you saw something that you thought was a deal breaker, that you could too, and there'd be no consequence to either side. People would say, well, we gave it our best shot and it didn't work. The issue then becomes, what about the contingencies after September 15, September 2015? And one of the questions I had is, although we have every hope and belief that this would be a successful program, what happens if 180 students don't arrive first year? What happens if 20 students arrive or 50 students? There's no magic number for me. It's more a case for the board, since you're going to be allocating resources to this program. We better make sure that you like what the number is, because this is the one intangible that, although we believe that we can fill this program, you need to be comfortable that if it flounders the first couple years because students are just getting used to the program, that you still fully fund it, despite the fact that there's only half of the students that we anticipated. We haven't agreed on what the magic number is, but I at least raised the question, what will the parties do that first, second, third year if there are insufficient students to run a full program like we anticipate? What happens if Salem Keizer has a financial crisis in year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? What happens if a future board, and I want to spend some time on what I mean by a future board, what happens if the board of directors for Salem Keizer makes an educational decision to modify the CTE program, downsize it, or eliminate it altogether? We need to make sure you are comfortable with those questions, and that Mountain West is comfortable. Again, they do not want to go to the very large expense of acquiring property, remodeling it, and equipping it if the board isn't all the way in. And so the question is, how much, what do we mean when we say the board is all the way in? Because there will be things we haven't thought about that may come up for the board, and I will be asked, how do we modify this program under the MOU, Memorandum of Agreement? Other contingencies, we haven't fully flesh them out. There might be some, I think I hit the big ones that I could think of. Now let me talk about the issue of binding a future board. As a general proposition, the case law states that if the majority of a board is up for election in any given year, you are a finite board. In other words, not a perpetual board. And this follows a line of cases that says a finite board may not bind future boards. Absolutely. And you are a finite board. 3 of you are up for election in 2015, and 4 of you are up for election in 2017. Now, you might all run again and all might be elected again, so it might be the same people on the board, but it's a new board. So if it's true that you're a finite board, and I believe you are, you cannot enter into a contract that binds a future board without giving the future board the power and authority to exercise a governmental function. And providing education to students is your primary governmental function. There is no way around this. You as a board cannot delegate that responsibility to a private entity. And so the challenge in this memorandum of agreement is, how do we create an agreement that binds the district to the agreement for 5 years in a tight enough way that gives Mountain West confidence that you are fully prepared to see this project through for 5 years, and at the same time build in enough flexibility so that a future board could say, we can't do CTE program anymore because our funding is cut, because, I mean, who knows what the becauses are. In 5 years, there may be something that none of us anticipate that make it very difficult for this board to continue to fund this full program. And so this is the struggle. And I will say it's been a very good conversation with Mountain West on these challenges. And I think we completely understand where they're coming from, and they completely understand where we are coming from. But my bottom line to you as a board is, I do not believe you can enter into a 5-year deal that involves a future board where there's no out for the future board or for the present board. Just to look at this kind of on a bigger perspective, we enter into contracts as a school district all the time. And in every contract that is of any duration, we have a provision in there that says this is all subject to funding. And so that's really our beginning point. What if the state reduces your funding? I don't believe you can exercise your primary governmental function without having some kind of a contingency built into this agreement. And I've built these in the current memorandum of agreement, but this doesn't mean that Mountain West is satisfied with this by any means. We have to figure out a way where they can feel like they have the protection they need, and at the same time you have the protection you need. Now, the board can, by statute, enter into a lease agreement for up to 30 years. And so the general rule that a board cannot bind future boards, there's a number of caveats to that. Yes, it can if you build some contingencies that a future board can exercise to get out, and that's normally what we do with all kinds of agreements, lease agreements with collective bargaining agreements. We have funding clauses to reopeners. Big vendor agreements, this is built into them. But with a lease agreement, the state statute gives you the authority to enter into a lease agreement for up to 30 years. So this board could bind a future board at least to the lease agreement side of this transaction, which gives us some creative possibilities for how we might structure a transaction where if the school board did modify or terminate the CTE program, you could still have responsibility under the lease, not for $1 a year, but the Mountain West could propose that you pay market rent if and when you terminated the CTE program. And we'll talk about some of those ideas here in a moment. Any questions about this limitation, your limitation on binding future boards?
Yes and no. If you were to read number 4 in your agreement, I need you to explain to me number 4, because I have a question about it as it relates to 4.2. I keep hearing you say 5 years, but I want to know when the agreement starts.
Under the way that I've drafted it, it would start, the first year of the agreement would be the 2014-15 school
Okay,
year.
and then in 4.2, you talk about 5 years, so this is actually a 6-year agreement. Not 5 years, it's 6 years.
That's not how,
If, the sentence, the parties are committed to funding and operating the CTE program for the 2015-16 through 2019-20 school years. You count up the years, that's 5 years, 14-15, 6 years. So it's a 6-year agreement. That's why I'm asking the question. How is it not 6 years?
I think, yeah,
Okay.
I think what Paul was suggesting in terms of the binding future boards conversation is to alter the years from 5 to 3. So this would be a 3-year agreement. And the lease could potentially be a 5 or 6 year lease under the provision that you can actually have up to a 30-year lease. That's one of the sticking points that we've been working through, because as Paul explained, doesn't want to bind future boards. So instead of having a 5-year agreement, it would be a 3-year agreement starting upon signing. So 14-15 would be year 1, 15-16, 16-17 would be the end of this MOU.
So the majority of the board that's currently here would
Right.
still be in place?
Yes.
Okay. But I still see 6 years here, as it's written.
one way to do this would be that the lease would not start until the students are actually in the building. Mountain West has talked about, well, what about having a 6-year agreement? We're not going to run a CTE program for 6 years, we're just running it for 5 years. And so this could be structured in different ways, and I've as part of our conversations, I started it at a much lower number of years. And Mountain West has suggested 5 years. If you cut this agreement down to 3 years, and the 3 years started July 1, 2014, then it would be within the term of the finite board. So these are some of the details that are not agreed to yet. Did you have another question?
I have several, but I'll wait till you get done.
So Paul, I have a question on the issue of the finite agreement. What I'm hearing you saying is that we can't bind future boards without certain exceptions statutorily, like a charter school, an extension of a charter school. They've given us the ability to go for a 10-year on a renewal with regard to that. But what I'm hearing you say on this issue is we could do a 5-year agreement so long as there were outs as they are outlined in 4.1. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we could do a 5-year agreement, as long as there were enough contingencies built into section 4.1 here that would build in enough argument of termination by the board if certain requirements weren't met.
And it seems like from what you just explained, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like from what you just explained, that one of those contingencies should say that in shortly thereafter, seating a new board in 2017, that you need a vote to continue it. Because that's
Be a
the end
yeah.
point of the finite board is July 1, 2017.
That's not what I heard.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Paul? Because we use the term agreement, and I think there are two separate categories here. One is the memorandum of understanding / agreement, and this has a term associated with it. And then we have a lease agreement, and that one could be for up to 30 years.
I'm talking about the memorandum
But
of
the
agreement, that
MOU.
we have the ability to, without a vote, say it can be a 5-year agreement as long as there are enough contingencies built in that allows the board outs, for lack of a better term, is what I heard you say, Paul. It doesn't require an additional vote of the board, so long as you've built in contingencies where the district, i.e. the board, has the ability to terminate the agreement if certain prerequisites are met.
Right, and in 4.2.1.1, on page 4, I said it's the intent of the parties that the SKSD Board of Directors would continue to fund the CTE program and renew the lease agreement with Mountain West into the future after 5 school years. However, nothing in this agreement restricts a future SKSD Board of Directors from making budget decisions or education priority decisions which modify or terminate the program during and after the first 5 years.
But my question is, where does the 5 years end? I believe it ends in 1819, not 1920.
Okay,
That's why I'm asking the question, because I think that's a point of confusion, at least in my addled little brain.
we can clarify that in terms of the dates.
And my question for Paul Kylo, not, we've got too many Pauls, is your concern simply to make sure that this thing hangs together?
Yes.
Or is your concern that there should be one of those two dates?
No, I
that is
just want it to
determined?
hang together,
Okay.
because I think that creates too much empathy.
Because my
a
question
spot
for
to be
Jim was, if we could write a 5-year agreement that was written like that, couldn't we write a 10-year agreement that was written like that?
From what I'm understanding from Paul is, yes, you can,
Not
so
that
long
I'm
as there are
advocating that, I just
contingencies
wanna
built
get it
in where
lost.
where the
what he
board
said.
has authority at some point, when prerequisites are met,
Right.
to terminate. And one of those may not be a prerequisite so much as Mountain West fails to deliver something, it's that the state fails to deliver funding. I mean, when you look at our collective bargaining agreement with our associations, we have reopeners in there for financial purposes. And we have that in our charter school agreements with our charter schools as well, that this is all contingent on monies being appropriated to the state school fund from the legislature, blah, blah, blah. I mean, but what I'm hearing from Paul is you can get around the finite board issue, that first legal issue that Paul brought up, so long as there are contingencies built in.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And the fact that we would have to build in contingencies is a challenge, because the Mountain West is ready to commit with a substantial financial commitment to this project. That's a pure benefit to the district and the community. And so if we have to build in contingencies that we can get out, it presents a challenge for Mountain West to commit the kind of resources that are going to be necessary for this. Now, the current best idea from Mountain West, as I understand it, and again, we're riding the bicycles. We rode the bicycles today, and things, the fenders are still not on the tires. One way that Mountain West has suggested to deal with the fact that you need contingencies is to build a 6-year lease starting July 1, 2015. pardon me, 14, that's right, in
signing.
3 months, right after your June board meeting. So for the first year of the lease, even though you're not in the property, is the 14-15 school year. And the lease would continue at $1 a year unless one of two things happen. If during the term of that lease, the board terminated the CTE program or substantially modified it in a way that was not acceptable to Mountain West, as I understand Mountain West's proposal, that would trigger the board essentially paying damages by way of market rent. And on the whole 148,000 square feet, which if you, at 40 cents a foot, which is about almost $60,000 a month, so around $710,000 a year.
But Paul, that's part of a lease agreement, correct?
Right.
Right.
So that what Mountain West is suggesting is, board, if you need the flexibility that we've talked about, we need a way to recoup our losses if you pull out early. And since this board could enter into a lease agreement for a longer term by statute, you could essentially build in the compensation for the board getting out early. And Mountain West is suggesting that the way to do that would be to value the square foot market rate of 40 cents a square foot, and the board would pay that, or that the school district would pay that for whatever remained on the term of the lease. And that's about $710,000 a year at 40 cents a foot. So that's one way that Mountain West has been able to get their hands around the concept that if the board needs flexibility, okay, but under the terms of the lease, it will cost the board.
It'll cost us $200,000 more to stop the program than to keep the program going at the first year level.
If I may just clarify something, may I, Jim, please?
Go
Because
ahead.
Paul said modify or terminate, so terminate is clear, you just suspend the program. I think the understanding relative to modify is if we choose to not add 2 programs per year, if we choose to slow it down and add 1 program every other year, for example, then the compensation rate that Paul is describing would apply to that square footage that's not being utilized.
That was my question. Are we bound in this agreement, regardless of our available funding, to increase 2 programs a year?
In the lease agreement, the second contingency for Mountain West would be if the board does not add 2 programs a year for 5 years.
So I have a question right there, because we got a problem. You're mixing lease agreement with operational agreement with memorandum of agreement. What you're talking about with regard to the addition of 2 programs, the way I read this memorandum of agreement, is it's under the operational agreement, not part of the lease. The lease should be limited to lease of the facility, not increasing the program, because the way I read this is that the operational agreement will outline that part. And I know all 3 documents are contingent upon each other, but in my mind, it is a much cleaner, simpler process if the lease deals simply with the property and the operational agreement deals with the operation of the program, the addition of the program. This memorandum of agreement is the beginnings of the commitment to go into negotiations on a lease, negotiations of an operational agreement, and I'm not quite sure, and it's a question I have, Paul, the master plan, because in part of this agreement it says it'll be mutually agreed upon, and then in part of this agreement it says the district shall develop the CTE master plan. So there are some internal inconsistencies, but in my mind, it's a lease agreement dealing with property, an operational agreement dealing with program operation, And the lease agreement may have things built into it like liquidated damages, lost rent, lost property value, all those things. The operational agreement should say at what level the district would add program or not add program based on that 5-year CTE master plan that the district has to come up with. Am I mixing my metaphors?
No, your metaphors are good, but what I will say is, this was what the bicycle looked like last Friday.
At 11 o'clock, right, I got that.
And so the amount of work that's gone into this, even this week, as we prepare, we have more ideas about how to solve the board's flexibility issue and Mountain West's desire to have an ironclad agreement. And the last part of this and is in no documents yet, because it's just an idea from Mountain West on how we might approach this. And the idea would be that if the board does not add 2 programs a year, that the space that those programs would have occupied would be, Mountain West would get, would essentially get the per square foot market rent for those unoccupied spaces. And that would probably we'd have to put some of that in the MOU and some of that in the lease.
I have a question about what we're doing here. I'm just not sure what you want out of us here, because it feels to me like we're, in this conversation, also building the bike. So it just sounds to me like it's all a gajillion questions.
Yeah.
And I certainly can't help you write this. I don't have any qualifications for that. So do you want us to tell you what our questions are that you want addressed? What is it that you're hoping to get out of us?
I'd like to clarify a couple things. I appreciate the question, Nancy. I think we asked Paul to come tonight because the board clearly needs to understand the risks involved in entering into any kind of agreement and the myriad of issues that are unresolved. I think for purposes of this evening, are there some general guiding principles or comments that you want to give us as we proceed forward? Now, we're not certainly asking you to wordsmith this document tonight, but are there issues that you believe very strongly in as a board that you want us to pursue? For example, is the lease agreement very important? And is it okay to go out a few years? Is it all right to have, as Jim described, the operational agreement and what that contains? Are there some limitations as to what you're willing to accept relative to risk? And we haven't defined those specifically for you to feed back to us, but it'd be interesting to hear, just based on what you've heard tonight, what are your concerns? And then are there some specifics that you absolutely say have to be in this agreement?
Paula, may I add to what you just shared? So, and I know Chuck has been really patient and wants to jump in. So, Paul described, in my opinion, 3 key categories. You can call them 3 buckets, and forgive the crude analogy. But one is relative to the MOU and what path it puts us on. It gives us direction as a district to continue to work with Mountain West to develop a lease agreement and an operations agreement. And what Paul described were exit clauses for us to say if we can't reach an agreement on the lease, that's an out for us, that's an out for Mountain West. So that's one, and that's a short term, in my opinion, issue for us to consider. That's a short term item. And we believe that we can work through those issues because both parties have best of intentions here. Those are technical issues. The other bucket, so to speak, is we reach a lease agreement, we reach an operational agreement, programs are up and running, we're in year 2 or year 3, and the board decides that they want to slow it down or terminate. That's, I think, where we're stuck in terms of the termination provisions and to what extent. The third piece that's key is the number of years that this memorandum of agreement is binding. So Paul, based on conversations and guidance to us relative to binding future boards, was recommending 3 years. The lease can be for much longer if we wanted it to be, and can spell out some operational terms, so to speak. But the MOU or MOA would be for 3 years instead of 5 years. And I'm hearing Jim say that we can do 5 years if we choose to, given that there are termination clauses, ways for us and future boards to terminate this agreement or to slow it down.
That was the question I asked council, and council indicated that that was an affirmative that we could with adequate outs,
Right.
for lack of a
Right.
better term.
So where we're stuck right now is relative to the termination clause, and we're still negotiating that. We're still trying to work through some of those issues. And even today, as late as 2:30 this afternoon, we were trying to come up with some creative solutions. So we are willing to continue to work on it. We're willing to go back to Mountain West and try and figure something out. But we wanted to let you know where we are in the process. And as Paul has said, we want to know what you're comfortable with and what directions you want us to go with this. So I hope that helps.
Want to help
Chris?
clarify before I start?
Yeah.
Because I'm ready to start telling you what I think.
Well, Nancy, do you have something before?
I want to tell you what I think also.
Okay. Chuck?
If I could, I just kind of want to restate that Larry's purpose in doing this is to provide a CTE program for kids and to give them hope and to give and build something strong for the workforce and for the community to attract jobs and to bring jobs here. And he's not looking to make any money on this. He's going to lose money on this. This is a gift. And I think what I have to do in my position is be able to recommend to him that it makes some sense. And part of the concern is that, and I think where a lot of this is going, is that if we invest $8 million in this project, the way the MOU is right now is that if a certain number of kids don't show up the first day, it's over. And he's got an investment in something that, is maybe not even going to happen. So that's why we put contingencies in it. And it's the same thing with a year or two down the road. We wanted to have 5 years with students to really give this an opportunity to kind of really see if it's going to work and make it happen. That's where the 5 years came from, is, in 1 or 2 years, it's, with just 2 programs, it's not going to happen. So for a guy to invest $8 million, just to pick a number, with all of these opportunities for the district to walk away, is problematic. So we're trying to come up with a way, a win-win, so that we can make this gift, make this happen, and yet at the same time, if the district, for good reason, needs to terminate the program, that we've got a way to kind of mitigate the losses somewhat. And so we've been talking about the ideas that if the district, after a year or two, terminates the agreement, then perhaps maybe one of the solutions would be, with a 5-year lease, to, at that point, change over the rate of the lease to the market rate rather than the $1 a year, to allow Larry some time to find another buyer or to cut his losses. Even if that happened, he'd still lose millions of dollars over the deal. So, I think those are some of the dilemmas that we're looking at. We want to really put something together that we can all be really proud of, and at the same time, not have it end in a year or two. And I'm not saying that's the intention of the board, but I'm just saying those are some of the practical things that we're looking at from our end. And we'd like, ideally, if we could have done it, it would have been just great to say, hey, we're going to do this for 5 years and, and just go with it. But Paul wisely is looking at all the things that could go wrong. And I think there's a lot of things that could go wrong, but they're minimal, to be honest.
Now I have a question.
Chris?
And it's for Chuck. As you've been out, and I know you have all over the country, been looking at CTE programs, have you ever heard of any of them having a hard time filling the program?
No. North Clackamas School District has got 6,500 kids in their high school programs in North Clackamas School District. And Salem, correct me if I'm wrong, but 4,500 of those 6,500, something like that.
It's about 3,500
3,500 are participating in CTE programs
every day.
every day. The schools that I saw down in Vegas, for example, they had huge waiting lists for students to get in.
That's been my experience. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, and so
I just don't think that's a reality that we're not going to be able to fill it.
well, I think with 11,000 high school kids in our school district, the chances of getting 185 are
Pretty
very
good.
good. So I don't see that as a big stumbling block, but you know, Paul brings it up, and it's something that you have to think about, and I get it. So
Are there that many kids that want to build bicycles?
Nancy, you had.
Planes.
So, the concerns I have, in listening to the budget tonight, I thought what I understood is that of the add backs that we made tonight, the bulk of them
That were
are.
proposed tonight. We didn't make them.
We didn't make them. You're right. We haven't made anything. We were just heard the proposal. And in the proposal, the bulk of those are on money that no one has guaranteed to bring back to us. The majority of it is grand bargain money, that's one-time money. So we're in a situation, this is the first budget I've ever heard in my time on the school board that's going in a positive direction. And I would hope that it is the first of several years of that. But the commitment to, regardless of what the to prioritize this over everything, if there's no money, in terms of growing this, seems short-sighted, that there are significant needs in the district that need to be attended to, and that in the context of those, that we can move forward, and that we have a commitment to move forward on CTE. But what if we are faced with increasing our class size at elementary in the next budget, and the decision is between keeping this agreement to go forward with an additional 2 programs every year, or raising our class size at elementary? It seems foolish to me to make that rigid of a commitment. If we could start with these 2 programs, have the hope to move forward as money's available, but not be bound to increase 2 every year, because that's a pretty significant ramp up. That's my concern. I would like to see numbers of what this could do in terms of high school class size reduction, because I think this is a way we will be reducing high school class size, and I'd like to understand those numbers, but I'm just nervous about locking ourselves into increasing 2 programs every year, and if we don't, we're gonna pay more money to not run them than if we ran them. And the reason we're not running them is because we don't have the money to run them.
Nancy, you done?
I'm done.
Chris?
I think I'm sort of in a similar place. I'm probably going to say it a little bit different, but for me, as 40-40-20 gains traction and continues hopefully to be sort of the way we look at what we're trying to do in education in Oregon, there is no doubt in my mind that something has to happen for that middle 40%. The ones that are not going to get their baccalaureate but are in fact going to get some sort of post-high school kind of training, technical training. And I just anticipate that as time goes ahead, even if there is not a CTE program sitting in a building out on Portland Road, this district's going to be allocating some money towards working with that 40%. So I have less of a issue with the fact that we're moving money into CTE because of that belief that that's the way things are going to go. But again, it's crystal balling, and so who knows. What my concern is that the only reason I can see us starting to back out of this commitment to Mountain West would be a severe lack of funds. Cutting another $54 million kinds of lack of funds, like we did a few years ago. And if that were to happen, I cannot see us tying ourselves into a contract that says we're now going to rent this facility, which is not useful for anything except CTE, for $700,000 a year or whatever it turns out to be. It just doesn't make sense to me to make that commitment when we know that the primary reason we would renege is because in deep financial doo-doo. So that, did I just say doo-doo?
You did.
And it's on tape, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's on
All right. So that would be my, that would be my point, is that I would have a hard time writing a memorandum of agreement that says that we're going to suddenly pay a whole lot more money for a facility that we can't use for anything except CTE if we can't afford to run CTE. So that's sort of where I am right now.
Just a second, Paula has something she wants to say, Jeff.
I think, I appreciate your raising the issue of could this facility be used for anything other than CTE? It's my belief, based on what I've heard in terms of the facility, that yes, it could. The district could repurpose some of that building for other needs that we have or other spaces that we're using that we're currently renting. And we have talked about contingency plans. Another option would be potentially to move existing CTE programs from a couple of our high schools, if those are sole source programs, and physically move that program intact to that site. So if the agreement allows us some of that flexibility, in an extreme situation, you're basically transporting, and that's not inexpensive, but it's not as expensive as starting new. So I think there are some contingencies that we could look at, provided the agreement is somewhat flexible if we should have a crisis.
Could I just point out that if you look on page 4, number 4.21, I think that's what Paula was talking about.
Yes. Thanks, Chuck.
It should be memorandum of agreement, right?
Mhm.
Understanding.
Yeah,
So-
but what I read that before and I thought, whoa, that's a good out. But then I heard something new tonight, and that was this idea of bumping the
Making it cost more for us to not run them is problematic to me.
However,
Well,
if,
Unless
we're mixing what we're talking about again, folks, because that's a lease agreement.
Right.
And one of the contingencies on this program going forward, at least that's built into it right now, is successful negotiation of a lease agreement. And I think what Paul is looking for and what district staff are looking for is direction on this memorandum of agreement. Not necessarily talking about the lease agreement right now, but talking about what we would want to see in a memorandum of agreement moving forward. And I think what we're all in agreement with, and I can't imagine the Mountain West would be in opposition to, is several of the contingencies are successful negotiation of a lease agreement, which may contain some of the things that's been brought up. Successful negotiation of an operational agreement, which would have different terms and things than this, and not quite sure how it's written yet. Is it a mutual or is it a district-developed 5-year master CTE plan? I think those are things that we can't mix into this because it's a contingency on this going forward. So what we've heard are some of the lease agreement issues, and this is my lawyer hat I put on, and I'm not lawyer for the district. This is how I think. They're each individual distinct documents. And so if you can't negotiate successfully a lease agreement, then we're done.
Okay, and yet, the reason I think both of us, our head went there is because we were asked to go there. And so,
And I want to bring us back to this agreement because the purpose of this work session is to look at this memorandum of agreement and what we are giving direction to staff and council on with regard to this. Because if we don't, and my personal preference would be, those are contingencies I want to see built into this. Successful negotiation of a lease agreement, successful negotiation of an operational agreement, successful, if it's, whether we're doing it mutually or whether we're doing it, a master CTE plan. All those things need to be built in, and if we can't get agreement on those, then we're done. And the other contingency, just my point here, is the funding one. I think we have to build that in, folks, because if you looked at the trajectory that Paula put up there, where we've been in the past, I think what Chuck just pointed out in 4.2 gives the district the ability to say, we've reached financial crisis, and because of that, we can't go forward. We build that into, not at that level, but into our collective bargaining agreements with our associations on financial reopeners. We built it into charter school agreements. We built it in with our food service contract with Sodexo. I mean, those are just minimally good business practices that I can stand up for this school district as a board of director member and say, we're doing the best we can to protect what we've got for our boys and girls and our taxpayers. Rick?
Well, the questions that Nancy and Chris were asking as far as relative to the lease agreement, right now, I'm saying are valid questions, because are we gonna vote on that lease agreement also? Or
Yes.
is this the one piece of document we're gonna get to vote on, is this memorandum of understanding?
My intent as board leadership on this issue is that each and every one of those agreements come for this board for discussion, decision, and approval.
Okay.
And what I heard from Jim was that you weren't going to agree to the memorandum of agreement until you agreed first to the lease agreement and the operational agreement. That's what I thought I understood. No?
I mean, we're talking about a first reading in May on this little piece, and then a vote in June.
I think what we've got is a memorandum of agreement that's before us today, and we could vote to execute that in June. More discussion, obviously, in May as a first reading on this, but it is contingent on the program going forward that there's a lease agreement in place, because the program doesn't start until the fall of 15. Is that correct, Paul? So we've got some time. They may not be able to, something may occur with the property they're looking at currently, that they may have to change properties. So it would be this agreement contingent upon a lease agreement being executed, an operational agreement executed, and that 5-year plan being created, is my understanding of the way this works. Paul, am I reading that incorrectly?
That's the correct reading.
I know some of those negotiations have to go on simultaneously, but.
When it would happen is I think, the tricky part for us.
Right.
I don't know how long, for example, the Mountain West has the option on the property. You know, if it's a short window, that's more problematic for us than if it's a longer window.
But I think what you were asking for tonight and what staff was asking for tonight was from direction from this board on this memorandum of agreement. Is that, okay, Paul?
Can I change the subject a little?
Sure.
Okay, just a little. I have a question for Salem, and then I may have a comment. Are we looking at moving all of the CTE programs we currently have to this facility, or are they going to stay where they are?
The plan that we shared with you last time introduces new programs. So these are additional programs, because the idea is to to increase the capacity of our
Okay.
district and
Okay.
expand what we have.
That's what I wanted to make sure I
Yes,
understood, because
right.
I did hear Paul, I believe, say that we could then take one of those programs and move them to this new facility if we needed to.
As a Plan B, I think is what Paula was referring to.
But my question then, that triggered in my mind, is that to Mountain West, is that a new program, or is that an existing program, so it falls outside the
Yeah.
requirement
Yeah.
for? Okay, so that's for you to think about. That was not my question.
Well, I can tell you our preference.
Okay.
And we've been talking about this for quite some time. The idea here is to add programs. So
Okay,
these would
right.
be new programs, would not adversely affect the opportunities that are available in schools now.
But the culinary program at South would be new to McNary, because they don't have that opportunity. That's what I'm saying. You know, the nuances of what new is. But that's not my issue.
Additional.
Additional, yes. My question is where I have concerns as I read through this document, I have several, but the biggest ones is it does appear that Mountain West has a great deal of influence in the curriculum and where it's going. And that seems to me, that's a school district function, which should be in the MOU, not necessarily part of the lease agreement or anything, operational agreement, but the educational components belong to us.
That gets into that master
Yeah,
plan. Is it a
exactly.
mutually agreed upon, or is it district? And there's an
Right. And we're
internal inconsistency in this
Yes,
document
That's
with
what I'm
that.
saying, and we're responsible for that, and that,
That's
in
the
my mind,
understanding.
is
Yep,
a
yep.
big deal.
Yep, I think that.
Everything else can, I think, can be worked out, but that, I don't know that I could ever agree to say Mountain West has any sort of veto. And I apologize, Chuck. I trust you, but I don't know all the Mountain West people yet.
And
So-
Paul, I think as you read this, it says at one point the district creates that,
Correct.
and then it's mutually agreed upon. And I agree with you that
And
that's a
you go-
5-year plan we need to
Right, you go
develop.
through all my highlighting, you'll find that
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So-
I guess my response would be is that, you know, clearly the program and the personnel and all of that is a purvey of the school district. That being said, CTE is most effective when industry is at the table.
Right.
And so, and we have an interest in making sure that whatever happens in there is applicable to the workforce. So, and plus we feel too that that could open the door for equipment and other things too if we have industry at the table. Ideally, we would have industry at the table guaranteeing jobs for these kids when they graduated from that program. So that's kind of the view of the quote advisory board that's
No, well, that's,
in place.
the advisory board I don't see as being what I'm talking about. Because I've been on advisory boards for this type of program before, and that's not what they did. The district, the school program, the educational body provided the curriculum. They just sort of looked over it, and they didn't have veto over it. And that's what I'm concerned about, is the veto.
Yeah.
No, because like I said, one of my minors at graduate school was vocational education, so it's like, okay.
So I'm going to look at board members because I'd like to wrap this up by 9 o'clock at the latest
Yeah.
tonight. So I'm looking at board members right now. Are there other things for this memorandum of agreement? And there are some minor things I've caught, Paul, but I can talk to you offline about that. Like you've got memorandum of understanding. You just need to do a word search to get rid of that. And there's maybe some other internal inconsistencies. But are there other issues that board members want to see built in as contingencies or protections that you believe the district needs that we haven't addressed yet? Because I think what we've talked about and got consensus on is got to have a lease agreement that's negotiated, an operational agreement. I think the CTE 5-year plan should be a district plan that we have input from, but it's got to be district driven. And then at least from my perspective, and I didn't see anybody shake their head no, was the financial out. If there are issues that come up financially where we've got to cut $54 million, that we've got to do it in a priority. And I don't mean to say this in a negative light. I think what Mountain West wants to give this school district is a terrific gift for our kids. And yes, we need to balance the idea of high school class size, but we also need to value the value of a program like this that can help with high school completion rates and help with our graduation rate. I mean, there are balances and checks that need to go in there. And if Mountain West is truly looking at $8 million, which is a number that Chuck has given us, you know, that's an $8 million increase in programmatic funding to the school district above the $9 million that Paula mentioned to us tonight. While it's targeted to one specific set of programs, it's one where we know we've had lacking before, and we need to build up, especially with the goals, as Chris has mentioned, of 40-40-20. So I'm going to ask the board, are there any other agreement contingencies you're looking at in here, knowing that we've got to deal with the lease agreement and we've got to deal with that operational agreement? Are there any other ones that anybody has a burning need to bring up? Rick?
Yeah, near the end, when it talks about donated property, I didn't see in here if we terminated the agreement, who owns the donated property? Be it a donated lathe or a donated,
It's in there, it's divided.
well, it didn't seem to jump out.
The donation of the equipment that's in the facility.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's there.
Right, the idea of this donation is that sometime in the future, and we haven't even got specific enough to link it to a particular period of time. It's out there as something that Mountain West may choose to do. They're not obligated, nor are you obligated to accept the property. But if the agreement was terminated within the 5 years, if it's a 5-year agreement, there's going to be no donation under the terms of this agreement, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be donated, like any citizen can donate equipment or property to the district. But if this agreement's gone,
There's a contingency on the donation, is what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other issues that the board needs to have Paul DeCopolos deal with in regard to this memorandum of agreement? Because that's what we were asked for guidance from the board on. And it's not a vote, we're reaching consensus. Nancy?
I'm probably beating a dead horse, but the piece that is so defined about adding 2 programs a year is, will Mountain West, and I guess this is a question for Chuck, will Mountain West view this as an utter and complete failure if it takes 10 years to get to those 10 programs, 5 programs? You're adding 2 programs a year, so to 10, who can do the math?
10?
10
Five
programs.
versus 10.
5,
You're right.
take you 10 years instead of 5 years. Will Mountain West view that as an utter failure when there's been an addition of all of those programs to the district? It just hasn't happened as quickly as the dream. And maybe we can do that, but maybe we can't. So I think in the memorandum of understanding, it's important to me as a board member to have that language softened, that
Well, I don't see anything in the memorandum of agreement that requires us to add 2 programs yet. What it says in 2.5 is that the parties contemplate that after the initial CTE program has been successfully implemented, the additional CTE programs of study will be added over time, such as, and then it goes on to list them, but it's a mutually agreed upon collaboration with the partners at a later date, which I'm assuming is going to be more spelled out in the operational agreement as to the timeline of the addition of programs, which also should probably be contingent on the availability of funding for the school district to add those programs.
this term was just discussed today. So this is, I don't have it in here, and I didn't want to put anything like that in here, requiring a certain lockstep order to programs. But that would be up to Mountain West, and my latest understanding is that would be important to them. And
I heard that tonight, and I just want to raise that I think that it's very successful if the timeline is loosened. It's still very successful.
I guess my response to that, Nancy, is you're dealing with a donor who has the best interests of kids at heart. And if ideally we would like to see this up and going and all 10 programs running in 5 years, but not, I can't imagine Larry wanting to do that at the expense of other programs in the district or at the expense of other kids. And so I think that even though there's expectations on what we would like to see, we also realize, the complexity of that. And you're dealing with a reasonable person who wants to do what's best for kids and isn't that stringent.
Chris.
I just have the quick comment. I'm sitting here thinking about a lot of these contingencies people are talking about. The thing that I think we need to keep in mind is, in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the operational plan, in terms of a lot of this stuff, if we don't do this right, they're not going to get any donations, because people are not going to donate money to a program that does not prepare kids to work in their mill or wherever it is. And so it's really important to me that we find a balance in all of this that allows the industry folks to have their input into what the curriculum is going to be, or at a very minimum, being able to say, here are the certifications we'd like to see kids have when they come out of it.
You saw the list of
Yeah, I saw that list of certifications, and that was I think that's a good way to sort of go about it.
And I think that's why we've got that sentence in there in 2.5, Chris, to
Right.
be honest with you, which
Yep.
is these additional programs of study would be developed by the district in collaboration with partners at a later date.
Right, and so
And there
I
may
think
be more specificity in the operational
I just
agreement.
felt it was important, if I'm going to say doo-doo on the tape, that I actually get that idea also out on the tape, I think we ought to be heavily committed to the idea that this is a collaboration, and that industry does need to have some say in it, or else they're not going to donate the equipment to help us do it. So,
Well, Chris,
So
you've
we're
done your duty.
there I am. Thank you. Very good.
Nancy, and then Rick.
I was just
It's getting
signaling
late.
that you should hit the gavel, that's all.
Rick had one more comment.
Yeah, I know it's getting late, but, you know, the objective of the work session was more than just a memorandum of understanding. There was an overview of work today. And I know Chuck wants to walk out of here with a sense of what he thinks is going on in the minds of all of us. And, you know, a month ago when we met, I expressed a concern about timing on this as far as money goes. And after tonight's budget message, I still am very concerned that when our first year back on level funding and a little more, and it is just a little more, that we may be dedicating some of those funds to a venture where we don't know if the funds are there in the future to make it happen in the way it's been laid out. This is a generous offer. We all want CTE, but I'm really worried that we tie ourselves into expensive money that may not be there when we've got all kinds of things we forgot about. I've got our budget committee meeting notes here from last February and March, where we heard presentations on infrastructure, on technology, staff quality, all the losses we've been suffering over the last 5 years. There's a lot of money in these documents we've been neglecting to spend. So I'm a little worried that once we're rebounding back, we're gonna spend it here. For me, it's a timing thing. It's a great program. I think we should be actually starting to talk about another way to make it happen. And that's through a local option dedicated to CTE, rather than funds we don't know are gonna be there. Just food for thought, all right?
Anything else? Staff, do you have adequate direction from the board now?
I have a clarifying question,
Yes,
if I
sir.
may. So the plan, thank you so much for the feedback and the great questions and the direction that you provided. What I'm curious about is, our plan was to bring you a first reading in May and action in June. So do you want to see, as we bring you this, as we continue to refine this document and clarify all of the things that you described tonight, do you also want to see a lease agreement and an operations agreement with the MOU for approval in June?
I don't know that we need to see them for approval. I think we need to see them as drafts so that we understand what's going into them.
Okay.
I think one other thing that I spoke to Mr. Tokopoulos about earlier today was an ability for this board to come into executive session with our counsel to discuss a letter with regard to legal advice that he would provide to us with regard to this, the lease agreement, and some sort of operational agreement as to legal advice and what he sees as issues for our ability to have a more frank discussion, legal strategy discussion with regard to the negotiation of those additional documents. But I don't think we need them for our June. We need to see the drafts and what are the issues, kind of like what we did tonight. What are the pitfalls? What are we negotiating? What's still hanging out there?
Okay, thank you.
With that, we're adjourned.
We'll get there. Well, there's a lot.